This story is about life as a military family in America in the 1950s and 60s. The sacrifices, the frustrations, the loneliness. But it's also about the pride, the joys, and the hope. This story was told to me by my mother, Sally Mickley, about her father, my grandfather, Ralph Nunn. My grandfather was a Navy veteran who served on aircraft carriers in three wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. His first job during World War II was in ordnance, handling bombs and other weapons. He quickly rose in the ranks to Chief Petty Officer, and after World War II, the Navy put him through several years of intense training to be an aircraft electronics technician. For 5 years, he was an electronics instructor, a job at which he excelled. He also proved himself a capable administrator, supervising hundreds of enlisted men aboard aircraft carriers deployed in the South Pacific. After retirement from the Navy, Grandpa continued his aviation electronics career, working in civil service until retirement. For my patriotic military grandfather, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was a personal affront, truly a day of infamy. He even wrote a poem about it, Pearl Harbor Remembrance, in which he expressed outrage for the attack and acknowledged the bloodshed and the sacrifice it took that we might be free. To his credit, during his deployments after the war, he visited Japan several times and grew to love and respect the post-war Japanese people. My grandfather was military, conservative, and American to the core. My grandmother didn't have much political interest, but she was raised as a token Democrat. One day, Grandpa said to her, quite offended, "You're raising our kids to be liberals." So, while my grandmother gave our family a solid foundation in Christ, my grandfather, to the day he died, preached, and I mean preached, patriotism and conservative politics. The result? A large extended family of conservative Republicans. By the time my mother was a teenager, she was aware that military life involved sacrifices, not only for those serving, but their families as well. Grandpa was gone from home almost half of the 24 years of his Navy career, for as long as 13 months at a time. He was gone for 3 out of the 4 births in their family. He was gone on deployments most of the last 24 months of his Navy service. My grandparents lived in 20 different places, at times in substandard housing. After World War II, Grandpa and Grandma, along with their first 2 kids, were sent to the Pacific island of Saipan. For the first several months, they lived in half of a condemned Quonset hut, sharing space with spiders the size of a plate and rats running across the rafters. My mother shared with us that growing up in a Naval Air Station community, accidents and casualties were a common occurrence. Even in peacetime, planes crashed and accidents occurred on aircraft carriers. Men could be swept off of a pitching deck, or someone might lose a limb in a propeller. These occurrences were very hard on Grandpa. Somehow, he took these injuries and deaths very personally. My mother remembers that every year of her childhood, it seemed like someone they knew was killed in military service. Mr. Martin and Mr. Spina from their church, her 6th grade friend Ken, who lost his dad, a high school friend's father who was MIA in Vietnam, and a beloved 4th grade teacher whose 25-year-old pilot husband went down. What heartbreaking losses. Whenever a plane crashed, my conscientious grandfather would sweat bullets, wondering if he'd worked on the downed plane's electronic equipment. There were times when the cause of a plane crash couldn't be identified and would be labeled as pilot error. Always wanting to know the why of things, Grandpa would get angry and say, "Damn it all, go ahead and blame it on the pilots. They're dead." One of the sacrifices of military life is separation. These absences are brutal on families. Among occupations, the divorce rate in the military is one of the highest. On the other hand, there's nothing more wonderful than a military homecoming. The one that Mom remembers best is when she was about 12 years old. Grandpa had been gone for 8 terrible months when everything went wrong at home. Appliances gave up the ghost. Grandma's new job was incredibly stressful, My mom's two teenage siblings bickered constantly, and all of them experienced health problems. There were several sports injuries, a broken bone, 2 cases of staph infection, and even one of ulcerative colitis. To top it all off, my great-grandmother Lena forgot a pan on the stove, starting a fire that demolished the kitchen. Then, suddenly, the separation was over. The family stood together at the naval airfield watching planes arrive, one of them bearing their dad. Grandma looked so pretty, all dolled up, as Grandpa would say, in a new dress. The immense tarmac was dotted with little knots of expectant families eagerly watching as planes landed and men began to disembark. They could barely contain their excitement. Then they saw him, their dad, coming down one of the plane's stairways. They waved frantically. Then he saw them. At first he walked sedately toward them. Then he dropped his gear and just ran, throwing his arms around his wife like he would never let her go. And finally, they were all a jumble of arms and kisses and hugs. Their dad was home. Later that day, Mom remembers all of them, sitting on the couch, Grandma and Grandpa like Velcro, and the kids crammed as close as they could get to their dad. Someone was always on his lap, and they couldn't seem to get enough of touching and hugging. That whole day, tears that never spilled over filled Grandpa's eyes, and he was literally shaking. Years later, Grandma shared with my mom that Grandpa was completely overcome by how much he missed his wife and his kids, and by how much he loved them. My tough old Navy grandfather. Eventually, the loneliness and difficulties of the previous 8 months were laughed at and cried over, but they seemed as nothing in the joy they had in their dad and in each other. This seems to me like a picture of what heaven will be. Now, we're away from home. We're deployed in his service, on active duty for the King, enduring spiritual warfare and the pains of a broken world. But one day, we'll be home with our dad and our family. Jesus will meet us and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We'll get as close to him as we can. There will be hugging and kissing and touching as we recount to him and to each other incidences of his grace and mercy in our joys, trials, and heartaches. He'll show us the bottle where he collected every tear we ever shed. We'll read together the book of remembrance that contains our prayers and conversations about him. And all of our earthly pain will seem as nothing in the joy we have in him and each other, because we will have finally come home.